Welcome to this Embarcadero webinar, Rapidly Design, Build, Debug, and Deploy Service-Based Solutions using RAD Studio and RAD Server. We'll be taking your questions throughout the webinar and handling them at the end. You can use the GoToWebinar Q&A panel to input your questions. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded for future playback. I'm David Intersimone, also known as David I, a software engineer and Embarcadero MVP. Let's get started with this webinar. We'll start with an overview of RAD Server with its REST-based API hosting engine, components, wizards, and other technologies. I'll show you how to build Delphi and C++ RAD Server resource extension packages. I'll show you examples of how to generate JSON data that works with Delphi, C++, and other client applications and services. Show you how to create an HTML5 JavaScript application using Sencha's ext.js that can leverage your RAD Server endpoint methods via AJAX calls. And finally, I'll show you how to deploy your RAD Server applications to Windows and to Linux servers. Today's computing landscape is no longer confined to just a desktop, device, server, or data center. Applications are being moved from the desktop to multiple devices, network edge connections, and to on-premise, public, and hybrid cloud services. With RAD Server and RAD Studio, you can build solutions that cover a wide spectrum of your company's and customers' computing needs and your business requirements. This webinar will show you how to quickly design, build, debug, and deploy service-based multi-tier applications using RAD Server's hosting engine that are available in RAD Studio Enterprise and Architect editions. You can also use the trial edition for development and testing, but you'll need a licensed version for deployment. RAD Server provides a turnkey application foundation for rapidly building and deploying services-based applications using Delphi and C++ Builder. RAD Server supports the REST protocol with JSON or XML parameter passing and return results. You can publish your APIs, manage users, and devices that are connected to RAD Server, capture analytics about the use and users of the applications, connect to local and enterprise databases using the FireDAC components, connect with Internet of Things devices, and also connect to other cloud providers. RAD Server also supports user authentication, push notifications, geolocation, and data storage. To build RAD Server-based applications, you first create your server API endpoints, then you integrate enterprise databases, cloud services, IoT devices, and other services to extend the application. You create your application services and install them into the RAD Server engine. You can use the RAD Server console and the management API to add users and groups and assign access rights. You then deploy your applications to a server, and from there you can manage the APIs, the users, the groups, and use the console to report on use and API activities. Finally, you build your client applications for multiple devices using Delphi, C++ Builder, or other application development tools. Provide that client user experience that makes REST calls to the RAD Server endpoints. RAD Server endpoint validates the user's right to access those endpoints. And the functionality that's provided in the endpoints does what's required and returns the results back to the client application. To get started in building applications, you'll need to have a RAD Studio Enterprise or Architect edition with a commercial license to build RAD Server applications. You can also use the trial edition for development and testing, but it does not support deployment to a production server. You install RAD Studio on your development machine. You can then build and test those applications locally. You can use the RAD Server setup wizard to create the RAD Server database, the configuration file that RAD Server requires, as well as create sample user data that you can start in your development and testing. The files created by the RAD Server Setup Wizard include the configuration file, the RAD Server database, and a registry key. In the Users Public Documents Embarcadero EMS folder, you'll find the INI and the interbase file. Looking at the contents of the RAD Server configuration file, emsserver.ini, as a text file, you can edit it with any text editor. You can edit it in the IDE as well. It has different sections of the INI file for setting up the source path for the RAD Server database file that was created. It's in Public Documents, Embarcadero emsserver.ib. The username and password for getting at the database. You can set up other connection information, server limits, and so on. Which port to use for development. The console login, that was part of the wizard. You can put in whatever the default is, console user, console pass, and all the different settings that are available there. So let's get started building applications. To build your first RAD Server application, we're going to use the RAD Server package wizard. We're going to create a package with resource, create some REST endpoints, implement the endpoint code, and then test the application package with the EMS dev server. So first we'll make sure that Interbase server is running, because Interbase is used by the RAD Server development engine to do your development and testing locally on your machine. So I've got Interbase Manager running, and the server is running. So in RAD Studio, we'll say File, New, Other. And in C++, we have a RAD Server node to create RAD Server package. And in Delphi, we've got a RAD Server package wizard as well. So we'll start the RAD Server package wizard. Now we have two choices here in the first page of the wizard. We can create an empty package where we would write code and instantiate objects in code. And then we can add resources and endpoints later on. The other choice is to create a package as a resource. The resource extends the REST API of the RAD server. We can provide the resource name and endpoints. So we'll choose this option to quickly get us started. The package needs a resource name, so we'll just give it a name of test to get started. Two choices again. Do we want to have it just be a unit or a data module? Let's use a data module because we may want to add other components and database access later on. And then we can define what endpoints we want to use. There's a checkbox down here at the bottom for selecting all endpoints, or we can deselect and choose just the endpoints that we want. Let's select all of them and click Finish. The wizard completes, and now we have a starting package file that contains the data module, and in the Requires node has just the base RAD Server API runtime package. There's no components inside of the data module, but under the covers, there's the class declaration of the data module with the name of the resource, test, and the endpoints that we chose, get item, post, and put item. It uses this resource suffix attribute to set the resource name and the any extension suffixes for each of the API calls. And then some implementations down here for each of the endpoints. Finally, there's a register method for registering the resource for that resource class name. We can do the same thing for C++. Go up to RAD Server, choose the resource RAD Server package, create a package with resource, give it a name, choose all the endpoints, and finish the wizard. And again, we've got a C++ package file, the RAD Server API, and the data module. And if we look at the implementation, we'll see the resource name the get item, post, put item, delete item endpoints. For C++, since it doesn't support those inline attribute settings, there's an attribute that we can set in the register method for the resource name and the different suffixes for the endpoints. And then it registers the resource. So that's how quickly you can get started building a package file. You could actually just compile and run this package and test it. Now, how the testing works from the IDE locally is that in the package file for the project, a host application gets created that runs this RAD Dev Server executable that starts the RAD Server engine and loads the target package file that's part of your project. So if we hit run, and now we have a development server running. Now previously I already ran the RAD Server setup wizard to create the configuration INI file. And I set my RAD Server port to 8087 that the development server is going to use. And it's loaded the different package resources, including that reg resource called test with some endpoints that we can use. And some other resources get registered as part of the RAD Server runtime, including the version endpoint, the API endpoints, users, groups, installations, push and edge modules, and so on. So all of that is functionality that is given to you as part of RAD Server. And then you just have your extension resources for the endpoints that you define. And your functionality can leverage all the other APIs that are part of RAD Server. First thing, if we open a browser, it'll display the version information of our endpoint. And then if we access the resource endpoint, which we named test, it will echo back the string, because that's what the get method said to do. And if we say get item, so let's say hello world, it'll echo back the name of the resource, test, and the item, which is after the slash, hello world. Again, this is done back here in the implementation of get to set the value of the response to be test as a JSON string, and for get item, respond with the name of the resource plus whatever item was passed as a value. We're going to echo that back. You can also open the console and see what's going on. Click login. You input the console user and the console password that are set up as part of the wizard, and you can look and see users and their activity. You can go back and look at API calls, and you can look at API calls over time, daily, monthly, yearly, and so on. And the same thing in C++, you'll create a JSON string with the name of the resource. We called it test, so here is the test string. We can get the parameters of the request, whatever that item was, after the slash, and then respond back to the REST call with the value of a JSON string, which is that test string, plus the item that was passed along the URL. Now, to enhance our RAD Server package file, we can also add another RAD Server module to the package, choose some endpoints, drop some database access components down, write a little code to return some JSON data from a database query, and then test the application. You could always add to an existing package file a new server module. So you'll notice that if I already have one server package created, I have a new option here under C++ and Delphi RAD Server, which is to say create a new RAD Server module to the package project, giving us 2 server modules. And I've already pre-built this package project with 2 resource modules. The first one, which is this data module that has my get item, and so on endpoints. And we have a second one that was created using the wizard. And here I have a database connection that connects to an employee database. We'll make sure that we can connect to that database. And interface is running, so we can access the employee database. Do a customer query. So here we've got select customer, and we get all our customer data. To generate the JSON, we'll use a standard storage component JSON to link to it, and we'll use the schema adapter to manage the database schema and the underlying data with the query. And again, this resource name is FireDAC, and we have our get and get item methods. The get method is going to create a memory stream, execute the customer query, use the schema adapter's save to stream method to take the data that comes from the query and set it in storage format, SF-JSON. And then we're going to set the response to that memory stream and return it back to the calling client application. So let's test this updated RAD Server package. Notice we now have 2 reg resources, the registration of the test resource and also the FireDAC resource with its get and get item methods. Open the browser, and here we use the FireDAC get endpoint, and we get all the metadata from the query, and we get all the customer data from the employee database. I've also built a client application to test. We use the MS provider component and have it connect to localhost in this case for testing and through port 8087. And then we're going to call the backend endpoint with the resource FireDAC to get the data and display that data up here in a memo. So the method says execute the backend endpoint called get customers and take the JSON text from the response and put it in the memo. So now we get the metadata and down here the customer data in JSON format. Same thing here in Delphi. We've got our original set of methods and the FireDAC resource module with the database connection, the query, schema adapter, and so on. And under the implementation, we've got the same, open the query, save to the memory stream the data from the query in JSON format, and then return the stream in the response from the endpoint to the API call. RAD Server also provides integration with JavaScript, HTML, images, CSS, and other web assets in an application resource endpoints. The RAD Server configuration file has a section labeled Server Public Paths that contains information and samples for setting up public paths of web content that can include the relative URL path, the directory where the static files are, MIME types that are associated with file types, and any extensions that are available. Let's take a look at the configuration file section. So here, the server public path section has these information about directories that can contain public files, such again as HTML and CSS and so on. There's 2 path statements. The name on to the left of the equal sign is arbitrary. And here you're setting up a path. That's the string that's going to be used as part of the URL with whether it contains the type of images, those are the directories, and then the directory path. If it's a default file that's dispatched when browsing to the root of the virtual directory, it's an optional parameter. The index file, or the index.html file, and then you associate either an array of MIME types or an array of file extensions for the different paths. So .js, .html, .css, for example. So again, the JSON-based entries map a computer directory to the types of web information the RAD Server application can use. So a simple example, a simple project here, both Delphi and C++ versions, define the resource name called Web Properties as a resource module, has a get and get item endpoints. The get endpoint is going to get called from the JavaScript code inside of the HTML. We'll take a look at that in a moment. And then return the response back that the time when the call was made. And then for the get item, just returning back the string web properties. So we remind ourselves what the resource name is and whatever was put on the item of the URI, the item that's after the item that was included after the call to the, and then here's the get item, which is going to return whatever item we put in as part of the call to the endpoint. We'll look at the index.html file. It's got some JavaScript here. In the body, there's a button, get RAD server content, and then that's going to make an AJAX call up here on the button click event handler, which just is going to call back into the endpoint of the resource that's called web properties and return the result back into the div. So we'll see that get method result's going to appear in this area of the resultant HTML file that we're leveraging. And again, the code here, code behind, is going to say, hey, the web properties get method was called, or the get method plus item was called. So we'll run the RAD Server development server with the package file. And you'll see here the web properties resource is there. And you can also see the public path definition that was taken out of the configuration file for images and content as the logical path, and then the actual real directory, and then which MIME types are associated with each of those logical paths called images and content. So if we open the browser, we'll go and say we want the content, and so it brings up the index file, that HTML file, and we can click the button and it calls the get method under the covers. And then after we click the button, we can go back and look at the log inside of the RAD Server development server for our package and see that first the version endpoint was called, and then when we used web properties, the get endpoint was called, that then executed and returned the result back into that div area of the HTML web properties called at that time. RAD Studio and RAD Server have two available frameworks for handling JSON data that can be consumed by different programming languages and tools. creating JSON strings, transmitting the strings as a response, and having the client application code process the return. It's nice for smaller amounts of data, but imagine you've got large arrays of JSON data. Are there different ways to handle the complexity of these types of JSON returns? RAD Studio provides multiple ways to deal with the JSON. There's a JSON objects framework, which creates temporary objects to read and write JSON data. There's also a readers and writers JSON framework, allows you to read and write the JSON data directly. So first we'll look at the JSON object framework, and then we'll look at how easy it is to use the readers and writers framework for better performance and improved memory consumption. Here's an example which is the simplest of writing JSON back to a client application. There's a get endpoint that returns data using the write start array, write start object, write property name, write value, and then end the object and end the array. So here inside of the get method, we just set the formatting for the JSON writer to be JSON formatting indented, so we get a nice looking JSON response. We do the write start array, call that method write start object, and then we output the property name we want and the value for that property, so test and foobar. We end the object and end the array, and then we all of that goes to the response and back to our client application. Inside of the array object, we might write additional JSON objects as needed for the application. So doing this all in code. There's the Delphi example and the C++ code again. Start array, start object, write out some property names and values, end the object, and then end the array of objects. So we'll run this example, and we call the endpoint simple JSON writer. And all it does is the square bracket, the array start, the object start, test and foobar as the property and value, and we're done. JSON writer can also be used with rows and columns of database data. We can create a RAD server package with a get and get item endpoints and use a SQL query to get at employee data and return it back to the client application as an array of JSON objects. So here we have the Delphi and C++ examples. We've got our database connection component, a query, and again, this JSON linked for the storage to handle the storage for us. If we look at the code behind, we do a query in the get method, select star from employees, and then set the JSON writer formatting to indented so we get nice looking JSON output. We do a write start array, and then for all the rows in the query, we'll write out an object, write out the employee name and the value of the name, for example, in that object, and then loop through to get the names of all the employees, and then write the end of the array, and the JSON result will get sent back to the calling client application. If we want to just get the information for a specific employee, then we'll close the query, do a select star from employee where the employee number is whatever item we pass after the resource name, and then go through for the field counts we get and output just the information for that one employee. So going through all the rows and fields of the employee database, and then just for one single employee. Same in C++, same code. We do the indented formatting, write the array, start, go through all the rows and fields of the employee table, and do it for one specific employee number as well. So let's run this example. Development server, we've got our endpoint called FireDAC with a get and get item. Let's just open the browser, call FireDAC endpoint, and now we get nice formatted indented JSON for each row in the table with the column names and the values in each one of them for each of the employees. If we put in a specific employee number, then we just get the object for the JSON object for that one employee with the columns or fields and the values within them. So you saw using the JSON object framework, creating arrays, creating objects, getting the values, and so on. The next part of the JSON frameworks allows us to read and writing JSON data directly to the client application. So here we have Delphi and C++ examples that use a memory stream to return all of the data, and this Delphi example uses a query to return the data. So inside of the get method, we've got create a memory stream, set the stream, and then run the query, and then use save to stream to return the JSON back to client application. In C++, we're just going to use a table operation to open the entire contents of the table and then save it to the memory stream and hence back to the client application. So less code, right, using the memory stream, and let FireDAC do all of the work under the covers. So let's open up an example, and notice now we get all of the metadata and data associated with the table. Again, we could write code like you saw before to just output the data portion of the table. I also want to point out that in the requires clause of these packages, we have to add a few additional runtime packages, the FireDAC common driver, and the interbase driver as part of the requirement for the additional components that we're using in the project. Same down here in the Delphi sample package. Now I'm going to show you a simple example using batch move, dataset reader, and JSON writer, where you write a small amount of code and use the components and the connectivity of FireDAC and its batch move, dataset reader, and JSON writer components to do most of the work for you to return clean JSON that can be used by Delphi, C++, JavaScript, and other programming language client applications. So in this resource module, we have the database connection component, customer query. Here's the batch move component, which has a dataset reader and a JSON writer. The dataset reader is connected to the dataset customer query, and the JSON writer uses JSON format and again default encoding. We can also set the formatting property under data def to be indented so we can get nice looking JSON result for all the data in the query. If we look at the implementation of the get method, it's just set the response body of the JSON writer to the batch move JSON writer. So set the JSON writer to write whatever the response is, and then call batch move execute. Same thing in C++ implementation. We just set the JSON writer for the batch move writer and call execute for batch move, and everything else is done. So much simpler, 2 lines of code to return JSON to a calling client application. Again, all the work is done by setting properties of the components of batch move and having these 2 dataset reader and JSON writer components added to your RAD server package. So let's test one of these. We're just using the browser. Here we've got our resource batch move that's got a get method. So let's go and open the browser. And now we've got an array of the customer data. Could have been the employee data as we used before, but 2 lines of code instead of all that other code for iterating, creating arrays and objects for JSON. And by having it set the indented field, we get nice looking JSON response. Again, consumable by both Delphi and C++ client applications, as well as JavaScript and other types of programming language clients. Now, in previous RAD Server releases, RAD Studio would generate method names that are similar to the service's verbs, get, post, etc. This is still the default in the latest release of RAD Studio, but starting with 10.3 Rio, RAD Server applications can also map HTTP verbs to a method with a custom name using the endpoint attribute. You can also map to external classes. So let's first take a look at how we can add endpoint method attributes to set the names that we want instead of the default names get item, delete item, and so on. Here we have Delphi and C++ implementations for custom method names for our endpoints. And so we use the wizard to create starting projects, and then we'll go into the implementation of each of these. So here's our resource name test, and now in the Delphi version we use the endpoint method, which says set this endpoint requests get method for this method called testGet, and use the endpoint method attribute for the endpoint request for get item with the resource suffix, and set that for the test item. So these two attributes right before the declaration of the test item. And then down in the implementation, we're just going to make sure that the get calls the right method and the get item does the right item. For the C++ implementation, same thing. We're going to set the value of the response to be either the get method was called, the custom test name get method, and the item as well. Down in the register, which we have to do in C++, we have to set the attributes. So the resource name is test, the endpoint HTTP method, which is going to be named testGet. We're going to associate that with the get method, the default name. Set the suffix for item, and then set the endpoint HTTP method for test item to be the get with item, and then register the resource. So let's take a look at these in action and make sure the right methods are called. So we have our resource test, which has endpoints now named testGet and test item instead of get and get item. All right, so if we open the browser and we just say test, then it called the right test get method, and hello, there it returns the item as well. So the benefit of having your own custom names is it allows you to create self-describing names for the REST HTTP verbs in your application server methods. It can help in documentation and implementation by someone building the client that call into your RAD server application to have real-world names instead of get item, and so on. Now, RAD Studio 10.3.1 also adds the ability for the RAD Server Custom Resources API to delegate request processing to a resource module containing Delphi fields, which are custom endpoint publisher classes and components. You can delegate modules fields of object type. The object type can be any type of class, including a T-component descendant, as long as they implement the IEMS endpoint publisher interface. So let's take a look at an example written in Delphi. So here we declare a provider class name. It inherits from T-component, and it inherits the IEMS endpoint publisher interface. We have an array here inside the class variable for storing the JSON that we want to return. And then we define the get item, put, post, delete interfaces. And then for the resource name test, we have our test resource that has that EMPS provider and a constructor to create the component. We register the test resource. And down in the implementation, we're going to create an object, an array of just some first names and second names of different employees, for example, and we write that out to the local storage as a JSON array and then free everything up. Then when we call the get item or get item by ID, then it'll process through that array of items to return the result back. And same thing for all the different interfaces along the way. Remove an item, we can add or post a new item and maybe get an error that the item already exists. And then down in the constructor for that test resource, and we're going to set and create the provider that's going to actually do the providing for the interfaces of our application. So we'll run this external classes example. And here we've got our resource test. Endpoints are emps.get, emps.getItem. So if we open the browser, we use test and then emps, and it will output an array of the first and last names for the employees. And then if we ask for a specific employee, for example, employee 3, we'll just get the name of that employee. So one called the get method, one called the get item method, again, delegating the implementation to a different class. So RAD Server also has new support for endpoint attributes for content type, and accept-based mapping can provide better support for resource mapping, which doesn't depend only on a URL, but also on the accept and content type request headers. This means you can have two distinct methods mapped to the same URL and HTTP verb while returning different types of data depending on the result. There's two new attributes, endpoint consume, which is used for put, post, and patch type methods for doing updates and adding new records, and endpoint produce, which specifies MIME types and file extensions that can be produced by the endpoint as a response to a get method. We'll take a look at a simple example of using the endpoint produce attribute. Here we have Delphi and C++ examples that use the endpoint produce attribute to specify different types of information that the methods can handle. So here in the Delphi code, we have our resource name called accept types. Suffix is just going to be star or any kind of file. And we use endpoint produce with the MIME type image / JPEG. And then we have this get image method that'll be called. And then for the get text method, that'll have an endpoint produce of application XML. So the implementations of each of those just says, go in, get a file from a subdirectory, open it, and return by calling set stream of that file stream from that file. And then for get text method, we're going to just go and get the contents of a file, for example, a text file, and return that back as a plain text type interface. We're going to go into our EMS server INI file, and we're going to comment out those previous public path statements we had and uncomment out another path, which is going to specify a page. The directory it's going to use is going to go into this temp page folder. It's going to open up the index.html file with looking for extensions .js, HTML, and CSS. So this HTML file that's going to be opened when we call the method is going to make calls back in to our RAD server package for accept types and pass in a JPEG file and also as the item a text file. And the same thing for our C++ implementation. We've got our endpoint context, and then let's go and get a text file or a JPEG. Down in the register method, we set the resource name, accept types. We're going to get any image of type JPEG that might be there. And again, here, get a text file. Now let's run one of these sample packages and see that we have the public path is the temp page with the default handling file index.html, and that we've got the accept types reg resource with two endpoints, get image and get text. So we can open the browser and put in accept types with a star, and that will display the second endpoint, which is the get text. If we use on the URL page, the RAD Server application will show that it called get image and get text file because the index.html file used the accept types resource to get us a picture and get us the text file. Notice that the get image and get text accept types methods were called. So we can use the developer tool support in Chrome. You can also use the developer tools for Firefox. Click on the network and header tabs, then click on the JPEG, for example, and see that the file name was requested as part of the URL. So the request header is down here. And the same thing for the text file. The request header, here's the request, and the request header accepted the text HTML through the application. So this simple demo just shows how RAD Server application can use endpoint produce attribute with a related MIME type to map the same URL to different methods depending on the request accept headers. Two more components that are available in RAD Studio 10.3 Rio include the EMS file resource and the EMS dataset resource. The file resource provides an easy way to just manipulate files in a directory, to list them, get them, add to them, delete from them, from those file lists. There's a path template property to set the path to a folder. And then there's the EMS dataset resource, which provides lots of control over the data retrieved. For example, getting all the data, a specific page of data, updating a dataset record, creating a new dataset record, deleting a dataset entry, all within the component. So we're going to take a look at samples for both the EMS file resource and EMS dataset resource components. So here I've created a sample package file for RAD Server. I've dropped down the EMS file resource component, and it has a couple properties we want to look at. One is what allowed actions. These are pre-built, predefined actions that you can use. I'm just going to use the list and get actions that will list the files in a subdirectory and get a specific file in a subfolder. You can set a path template down here property, which has the name of the folder, and then if we pass an optional item as the ID of the file, then we can display the file. So if we look at the implementation for the class, we've got our resource name, which is called files, that's fine. And then the list, we're just going to pass the slash, so we want a list of all the files in the folder using this resource suffix attribute. And for the get method, we want to get a specific file, so we'll use the curly brace and the name of a file inside of the folder that we're navigating to. So no code, just having it all process inside of the allowed actions of the file resource, and then using the resource suffix to do the identifying of what you want the methods to do for get. Same thing in C++. We do it all in the register method. So the resource name is files, and then the resource suffix for list is going to be just the slash. And for get, it's going to be slash and some file name ID. So we'll run this sample package, and you'll see the RAD resource has the endpoints EMS FileResource.list and EMS FileResource.get, and then put and delete if we wanted to do something, other processing, add a new file or delete a file. So these again are mapped to the predefined actions. Let's go and open the browser. And if we just, for example, put files, the name of the resource, then we'll get a JSON array of the file names in the subfolder. So these different files. And remember that get was had a suffix of /ID. So if we put in, for example, Charlie and David I in coats and ties, then it will just return the image. If we choose a different file, then it's again the same thing. The file resource will do the right thing. It'll just return the file in the browser. The great thing about EMS file resource is no code is required to get the files list for the designated folder and to display the files. Of course, if you wanted to do more, you'd probably write some additional code to do something special with the files and maybe handle specific file types that wouldn't necessarily naturally display in a browser or in a client application. Now let's move on and take a look at the DataSetResource example. Here we have the Delphi and C++ implementations of a package file that uses the DataSetResource. We've got a database connection. We're going to query customers. We're going to use the schema adapter to do processing and storage link. The customer DataSetResource component has this allowed actions list, for example, list, get, just like we saw before in the file resource. These are pre-built actions that are available. And then post, put, and delete. We can go and make sure we've got the right data sets. We want the customer query data set. If we want to only display a few rows per page, we can set the page size component. If we want to do sorting on a certain column, we set a sorting params prefix, and then in the value fields, we specify the included fields that we want to sort by: customer number, customer name, country, city, and so on. And then if we look at the code behind, again, there's no code. It's all done by the pre-built actions in the customer DataSetResource, or the DataSetResource component. We have our resource name DataSetResource, and here we want all the customers. So we put for the list, we put the slash suffix. And if we want a specific customer, then we can do the slash, and then the primary keys column, in this case, cust underbar no. Same thing in Delphi, we put it inside of the DataSetResource as the resource suffix before the DataSetResource declaration. And again, no code, just registering the resource itself. There's also some additional options that I should have pointed out. Do you want to enable parameters? Do you want to enable paging? So I have those turned on. Do you want to enable sorting, and so on? And so you can turn on and off these different options that you want to be available for your allowed actions. So the other thing I want to point out is for the customer query, similar to the FireDAC query we've done in previous examples, we want to bring up the SQL property. Notice that I've added an if there's a sort, then order by what that sort variable is. So for the customer query, it allows us then to order the resultant data by one of the sort columns using the prefix prepended onto the sort name in those value fields. Again, all of this is happening inside of the DataSetResource component instead of having to do it in code. So we'll run the package file. Here's the RAD resource, DataSetResource, and then it's that dataresource.list, .get, .put, the different allowed actions that we wanted to implement. So if we open the browser, type DataSetResource, we get the array of the customers with the columns that were chosen. We can go and put a specific customer ID, and we see just the information for that customer. Because we had paging turn on, we can say for the data resource, pass the parameter, just give me the first page. And since we had the page count to be 3 rows, we're getting 3 rows of customers. If we choose a page number that's beyond the data set, then we get the null array. Right? So we're past the end of the data set. Using the sorting operation, we can say, get me a data resource and set SF customer, for example, ascending. So it'll give us the customers by customer name. So 3Pad Corp, Buttle, Griffith, and Company, and so on to order. So we used, again, remember I had that sort prefix, SF, and then the name of the column, one of the columns from the value. If we want to do a more complex sorting, we can set the sort prefix, for example, by country descending, and then state province ascending, and then within that city. And so you can set up here, we've got country descending, so USA, let's see, down here, Belgium, England. I guess Belgium was the last one in our customer list. So that's descending. And then by state and province, and then city within state province. So if we had to California, we've got San Diego here, and we've got Pebble Beach. So Pebble Beach comes before San Diego. You can use combination of these different value fields and the sorting prefix string, ascending and descending. You can also create client applications that talk to a RAD server that use the DataSetResource. So here's my provider. It's going to go through localhost. FireDAC client's going to get that resource as DataSetResource. Right, the provider is there. The schema adapter, set those properties get set by default. We're going to store the data in an FDMEM table through the data adapter, getting through the schema adapter. And then we're going to display the information in a grid using the data source. So we've got 3 buttons in our client application. First one is going to call the endpoint, clear any parameters maybe from one of the other buttons. We're just going to call get data. The second button click is going to set the parameters to be page 2, for example. Just give me page 2 of customer data, and also sorting by customer name ascending. And then 3 is going to sort by country ascending. So this gets us all customer data, just gets us page 2. Again, page row count was 3. And let's get the customers ordered by country. So over here, if we go to the country column, it's there. So next we're going to take a quick look at using Sencha and the Sencha architect to build a JavaScript web client application that's connected to a RAD server application. Now there's lots of steps involved, so I'm only going to show you a little bit, but it's fully documented how to go through and create from scratch your RAD server, and then go and use the Sencha architect to create the user interface client side. So let's take a look at what that project looks like, both on the RAD server side and then what the code and the definition of pages user interface looks like in Sencha Architect. So here's our simple RAD server. It's got a database connection, a query that's going to just get the employees from the employee database. And then we're going to use batch move with a dataset reader and JSON writer. You've seen those before to create the consumable JSON data for the employees. And then the JavaScript client will consume that data. So we've got both the C++ version. It just says set the JSON writer of the batch move to be the response body, and then execute the batch move like we've seen before. And the attribute is just employee data is the name of the resource name. And for Delphi, same code, just set the JSON writer, and then execute the batch move to get the data from the query. And there's our employee data in nice JSON format, an array of employees and their columns. Over in Sencha Architect, we've got an interface that's created. There are lots of components available. You should feel very comfortable working in this environment. You've got buttons, charts, containers, forms, grids, and all sorts of other things. And then you can choose from those different buttons and containers and grids and viewports and so on. Down here in the configuration are what you might consider the properties and their values. So you set some of those. You can search in the search box for things that you're looking for. And what I've done is I've put down a tab panel component. The tab panel component, all of this gets generated, the controller and the view, and then the code behind. We can also, tab 2 has the employee data. So here's some grid columns inside of a grid panel that is connected to a local JSON storage, which is called My JSON Store. So here's the employee fields that are coming from the data model, and here's the JSON store, which gets populated by making an AJAX call to localhost 8087 to our RAD server application employee data, and the reader is going to be of type JSON, is going to come back from that RAD server application, as you saw me just execute previously. So under the grid panel, we can see here's some sample generated mock data, and then the actual data will happen when we execute the client application. We also have for the button on the first tab, we're just going to call into the version API, make an AJAX request, and then if it's successful, we're going to decode the response and set the button's text property by calling setText. Just returns the version, get that object, the version, and the server. And then if it fails, if it can't connect to the server, then we're going to output the status of the failure to connect to our RAD server. Maybe I didn't start the RAD server, for example. So just to summarize here, we've got a panel with 3 tabs on it. The first tab is just going to have a button that we can click on, and the click handler is going to give us the version information. And then the second tab is going to hold the employee data JSON that comes back from the RAD server application. If we look at the JSON store, which is going to make the AJAX call to get the employee data, we've set the auto load property to true, so it'll automatically load when the application loads. And since it's on tab 2, it'll be the tab that's hidden temporarily, but it'll be loading in the background while we're still on tab 1. So let's go and preview the app, and it's going to call out to our tab. There's the button. So if we click on My Button, it calls that onClick method, and we get the version 4.0 and the server name Embarcadero EMS. If we go to tab 2, we now have all the employee data that came back from our RAD server application. So drag and drop environment for creating components. So Sencha Architect gives you a set of reusable components. It generates under the covers the JavaScript and the definitions based on setting properties. Lots of different visual components. Easy to build your applications for JavaScript and client, and do custom coding as well. I want to refer you to the ebook for this webinar, where I go through a complete step-by-step. You can download the Sencha Architect Trial Edition, gives you a 30-day trial, which lets you build client application that use AJAX calls to call into your RAD server applications. In this last part of the webinar, I'm going to talk about some of the steps involved in deploying your RAD server applications to Windows and Linux. Again, there are lots of steps. We won't be able to go through all of them, but the documentation covers how to install Interbase for Windows, which you should already know about. You need a license for Interbase. For RAD server, you want to make sure you have IIS 7 installed, and then create 2 websites with virtual directories for RAD server and console. You want to make sure your configuration file is set up for the server and console. Configure your ISAPI DLLs, because for deployment, the RAD server DLLs that are launched that then register your RAD server application packages, just like you saw in using the development server application. Then you'll copy over your package files and any runtime library files and supporting package.it files, and then you can do your testing and deployment of your RAD server applications and the extension packages on the production server. Same thing for Linux on Apache. You want to make sure you have the latest version of Apache 2, that you've installed Interbase for Linux and used your RAD server license on your Linux machine. You want to make sure to install the RAD server files for Linux, configure your INI file to point to the right database and port that you're using for your RAD server on your Linux machine. You want to install and set up RAD server for Apache. There's different steps for setting up the paths to the shared object files for the RAD server engine and for the RAD server console. And then you'll copy over your extension packages and any supporting runtime library files, again, to Linux. And you'll be set up and deployed, and you can do your testing to make sure that everything is connected properly. So first thing, in the install directory for RAD Studio, there's several folders that have information that you'll need to know about and files that you'll need to use. In the EMS server subfolder, there's the RAD server install shell script and the tar file for all of the files associated with RAD server. So you'll want to copy those over to your Linux machine and then run that shell script to install. In the redistribution folder, there's the runtime shared object files for all the different things that you might need in deploying applications to Linux. So FireDeck drivers, you'll find different drivers for different databases, backend component files, and so on. Just anything that your RAD server applications might need to use, or for that matter, any other applications you're building. You might need some runtime libraries that are required for Linux, and in my case, I have a Win64 version of Windows that has IIS 7 installed on it, so I want to have all my files associated with database access, the client libraries, the console, the server DLL, and the console DLL. Those are the two that are going to be launched that then will launch your package files through the EMS server DLL for the different packages that you provide. There's also a PA server for Windows and a PA server for Linux. So if you want to use the platform assistance server in the IDE to send your applications to a Windows server machine or to a Linux machine, you can use the PA server, or you can use network commands or, file transfers and so on as well. All of the pieces and parts that you need to deploy, except for, of course, the licenses for RAD server. You'll also need an instance license file for interface for RAD Server so that you can use the RAD Server storage associated with users and groups and so on. I'm going to switch over to an RDP session for my Windows Server, and here I've brought up the IIS Server Manager, and I've created two default sites. I've split up the RAD Server and RAD Console into two different sites. Sometimes you might want to run the console on one machine and the RAD Server on another machine, or you might want to run them on the same machine and then use a browser to get to the console and browser or client applications to get to the server package files as well. So a couple things that we've done here that for handler mappings, I've got my EMS server DLL enabled so that I can use that ISAPI server for my RAD server packages. And I've got the console handler mappings so that my EMS console DLL is enabled for use as well on my server. All right, so we wanted to make sure that all of that was set up and configured. So I also want to make sure that my Interbase server is running, so it's running over on my server. Just make sure that IIS is running. I've modified the RAD server configuration file, the database instance name for Interbase RAD server, and then my EMS server database file is over here under inet pub www-root, and then set up any other configuration options that you need for your RAD server. If you go to our inet pub folder, www-root, go to RAD server, you'll notice inside here I've got files deployed that I need as part of my packages and as far as RAD server is concerned. So the INI file, the EMS server DLL, some other runtime files required. Since I'm going to access data, I want to make sure that I have my FireDAC Interbase driver if I'm talking to an Interbase database, and the common drivers and so on. And then I've also got a sample package file that I've copied over to do testing of deployment on IIS. And then you'll just keep adding to those files as depending on what your RAD server application packages are doing. Same thing for the console. I've got the INI file, the EMS console DLL, and some other files available. The documentation will tell you the minimum files that are required, but if your application package, for example, uses SQLite, you'll need the FireDAC SQLite driver. One other item that you need to work on is to bring the web resources over for the console. So in my console, I've got the web resources. These are the JavaScript and CSS and template files for running the console, which is a browser-based and console backend set of functionality. So to do that, if we bring up the INI files, if we go to the console paths section for ISAPI or for Apache, in this case I'm on IIS, so ISAPI, we want to set the resource files to the path where this web resources folder is found. You can copy that web resources folder from your install folder for RAD Studio over to your deployment machine. That way all the right files are there for the user interface for the console. So for example, if we run the console, we can log in with our username and password. And here we've got the user, and we can look at analytics. I haven't been doing very much over here on the server side. Total calls, hadn't done anything. But during the year, I did some development and testing back in March and April. So console's working, Interbase is running, RAD server license is running. Next thing we want to do is make sure that the RAD server is running. So we just go to our URL, put RAD server /emsserver.dll/version, and it should echo back the version number. And then over on Linux, you want to make sure you have Apache 2 running. I'm running Ubuntu 16.04 long-term support. So I've got Apache running after installing. To deploy that RAD Server application, again, I showed you where to get the install script. You want to install Interbase as well and make sure Interbase is running. And there's instructions in the doc wiki about how to set up Interbase so that it starts up as a service. After you've installed Interbase and deployed files, you can test to make sure that your Interbase is indeed running. So on Linux, the RAD server gets installed into the user lib EMS folder. And here are your runtime shared object files for the RAD server, as well as any of your package files that you copy over that you want to use. You've got the libmod EMS console shared object and libmod EMS server. So these are for Apache modules for running the EMS server and the EMS console. You've got your INI file and your RAD server instance of the Interbase database that has your user information and devices and other things that are associated with managing client applications that are going to connect in. Looking at the files, it says, okay, the database is in user lib EMS. In our configuration, the instance is RAD server, and so on, just like you saw before. For the console, if we go to console paths Apache, then we have the resource files, user lib EMS. So those are have been deployed over to Linux. And then over in your for your Apache configuration, etc Apache 2 mods available, you want to create two files, ems config and ems.load. EMSconf sets up the configuration for mods available directory. We can go and look at that, and then also the load modules to tell Apache which shared object files to load for the server and for the console. So let's take a look at so the ems.load file has load module, EMS server module, its name, user lib EMS, libmod EMS server.so, and for the console, EMS server console.so. And then for the configuration, if we look at ems.conf, it says, okay, the location for /EMS server is going to be set the handler EMS server module server handler. And then for the EMS console, again, have a set handler for libmod EMS console handler. And then you want to enable the RAD server modules just using A2 and mod space EMS, and that will set up Apache so that it knows about these two server modules. Then if we want to go back and get the EMS version, we can just say EMS-server / and then the endpoint or the resource version, which we'll call the get endpoint, and we'll return the version number in the EMS server. And that, if all of that is okay, then that means that you've set up your Apache correctly. The only other thing to do is to test that you can call your extension package, which had a resource called test. So EMS server looks and says, oh, I find a resource that's been loaded called test. And we can go in here and say, call the test with a test item. Just hello from Delphi for Linux, and it echoes back, and that calls the test item. Once we've done that, we've said, okay, I'm ready. I've done my simple setup. I've done copied over my package file, the first one that we did, compiled for Linux, and then we can test to make sure that it's all working on our Linux, in my case Ubuntu, with Apache. And now that all of that is working, we've tested just to make sure that we've got the setup on Windows and set up on Linux. We've tested the console, and we've tested the the server and server packages, and everything is ready for us to continue to do development and deploy those Windows packages or Linux shared object packages to our different production servers. So now, after all of that, it's time for questions. So we'll go over to the question panel. Again, you can use GoToWebinar to do that. And thank you for being here in this webinar today. And look for an ebook and blog posts about some of these topics associated with everything that we've covered today. Look for the sample code on the Embarcadero RAD Studio GitHub, and you can download all the samples that I showed plus some additional ones. If you don't have RAD Studio Enterprise Architect, you can use the trial. If you want to do some JavaScript testing with Sencha Architect, you can download the 30-day trial of Sencha Architect and build client application that can talk to your RAD server backend applications for development purposes. And then if you want to deploy those applications, both the JavaScript applications and the RAD server applications, you can contact Embarcadero Sales to get licenses for doing build and deploy. All right, let's get to your questions. Okay, lots of great questions. I think Jim and Rebecca may be with me as well.
We are.
Yes.
Okay. There were a couple of questions early on about encryption and compression of the JSON data that you might be sending back. You need to do that yourself. You can do that in your endpoint code. We don't have any built-in encryption or compression that automatically happens. There's no little property you set. There are lots of different encryption and compression libraries, and some of the encryption controls have to do with export licenses and whatever. But since your back-end points are creating the JSON to send back, you can take those JSON strings and do whatever you want with them on the client and the server side for both encryption and compression.
Although if you're running it as an ASAPI module or an Apache module, the Apache and ASAPI and IIS can be set up to automatically do the encryption and compression. So if you have a SSL certificate installed on your web server and you enable those properties, then everything that goes through the web server, whether it be a static web page or your ASAPI module or Apache module, automatically gets encrypted and compressed by the web server. And then, so, but definitely check that, make sure that you have it set up correctly. Don't assume it's working. But yeah, you can do it either manually do it yourself or let the web server do it, but there is no properties within RAD server to turn that on automatically.
Yep. Yeah, you can do it at that level. There's a question about protecting endpoints and authentication. There's a whole API and there's lots of samples for checking logins, passwords, authenticating. There's a sample that integrates to Active Directory if you're on a Windows system and others. So check out the samples that ship with RAD Studio, both for Delphi and C++, about authentication. You can also control things on your server side by setting groups and giving group access versus individual user access in using the console to do settings that way. There's lots of, again, examples for doing that, and there's videos on the Embarcadero YouTube channel for how to do all the authentication for devices and people that might be connecting to your RAD server. There was several questions about pricing. I always refer everybody to Embarcadero Sales. Jim and Rebecca, maybe you have some other things. I know Marco did a blog post in August of last year that says if you have Architect Edition, it now includes RAD Server multi-site license for deployment. So
the Enterprise Edition includes a single site deployment license, and Architect now includes a multi-site deployment license.
Okay, cool. There was questions about securing a JSON data store, and also sort of question/confusion about Interbase's use in RAD Server. RAD Server uses a license of Interbase for storing user data and passwords and groups and all the analytics, all those things that are in that emsserver.ib file. For deployment, that requires an Interbase license and an Interbase instance running. And if you look in the configuration file at the front of the RAD server, the INI file, you'll see the name, you set the string for the name of your instance for the RAD server instance of Interbase, and the username and password for that, as well as if you have a secure addition, that information as well. So then if you're going to use Interbase as a regular SQL database, you'll need a separate license for that. Now for development, you can use on your development machine, when you're using the RAD server engine for development and testing, you're just using the Interbase that comes with RAD Studio, Enterprise and Architect for doing that testing. But then when it's deployment time, you'll need the deployment license for Interbase for the RAD server storage portion. Now, if you want to have some other JSON data store, there's plenty of those out there that you can use to cache JSON and things of that kind. So FireDAC, of course, can cache updates. If you're making changes in a connected or disconnected world, there's lots of examples of doing that and then calling apply updates from a client or server. And so anything that's done at the database FireDAC level is supported already in FireDAC for doing those kinds of connected, disconnected operations. There was a question about, can you update a BPL without stopping the server? The thing is, you'll need to at least do some control of the EMS server DLL at that level so that someone can't call an endpoint right in the middle of you copying things. I don't believe I have to stop IIS or Apache at that level, but I need to do something to turn off an endpoint and a resource so that I can do updates of those things. But normally the best way is always, of course, to have a maintenance period, stop everything, do your updates, and come back and start everything up again.
There are a number of options in that regard, depending on how you have. That's one of those things that takes place at the Apache or IIS level. So, for example, you could set up load balancing, right, and redirect all the endpoints to a different instance while you update one, and then redirect them back to that one while you update the other one. But that's an IIS Apache administration thing that's not specific to RAD server, EMS server. So, but yeah, there are a number of options around that, like David said.
And also there's questions about, throughput, high availability, performance. There are some settings for threads, thread pools. You can set up application pools on the server sides with IIS and Apache as well. So as lots of requests come in, those threads instances start up to handle requests coming into via the web server. So there isn't anything specific other than in the RAD server configuration file where you specify. At the same time in code, you could start up and use the parallel programming library to do all sorts, start tasks, threads up for functionality in your own code. If you're doing lots of long duration SQL queries or whatever it might be. Otherwise, you've got the full control and throughput of, as Jim mentioned, all the things that you can set in IIS and Apache. There's a question here about if multiple requests using the same database components. Again, all of that works with FireDAC and And at the database level, when requests are coming in and you're doing things like, everybody's updating a database and so on. So that's handled at FireDeck and ultimately at the database level, depending on the database you're using, right, for your database portion as opposed to the RAD server storage that we talked about before. Let's see. And again, Interbase, I use Interbase for my database samples. Interbase is required for RAD server, both for development and for deployment. Again, you use the Interbase license that comes with RAD Studio to do your development, and then for deployment, the licenses, as Rebecca mentioned, a single license in Enterprise for a deployment and multi-site license in Architect Edition. So you'll always need Interbase. It's not replaceable as it relates to the RAD server administration API and the RAD server storage information that's kept on users, groups, devices, analytics, and so on.
Yeah, but that's internal to RAD server. I mean, once you have it set up, it's kind of not something you need to be worried about. But yeah.
And there's an administrative API that gets registered that has endpoints that you can call in from your own code to, if you want to have your own client to, or some logic to create users, create groups, update groups, push notifications, and so on. There's a whole API for that accesses that RAD server database under the covers. And there's lots of examples in the doc wiki and the documentation for calling the administrative APIs. There's a question about testing. I'm not sure what testing was done for larger installations or larger tests of RAD server. Do you know anything about that, Jim? Sort of stress test?
Not offhand. I know there is testing, and I know there are users using it at various instances or different size instances, but I don't have that sort of results handy.
Yep. There's I should mention I put the URL to the ebook in the chat window. The ebook is available to all enterprise and architect customers. So when you log into Code Central, it knows what licenses you have. And if you've got recent enterprise architect, then you'll be able to download the ebook. It's I think it's 197 pages, almost 200 pages in a PDF for the all of the steps. I had to compress everything down so I didn't go on for hours in this webinar. So, and then I also put there's a series of 3 blog posts related to this topic. Jim's put the first one up, and I put the URL to the first blog post, building your first RAD server application. And again, all of the samples that I do, with the exception of one, are both in Delphi and use C++. So you can see the servers and clients in both programming languages in the blog post and in the ebook. There was a question here about there's lots of samples and RAD servers not well explained. So again, the ebook, I don't know, I spent 197 pages worth to explain more, but at the same time, that was focused on some sets of functionality, especially some of the new capabilities in the ebook, or you can search. Kerry Jensen also did a technical paper based on EXE 7 that has some of the base parts. There's also, what are they called? The industry templates for healthcare and hospitality.
Yeah.
There are blog posts and videos for, I think, at least 3 different full-blown examples of using RAD server and building clients, both mobile and desktop clients. So you should check out, you can go into Get It, the Get It package manager in the IDE, and you'll find those industry templates.
So David, here's a question about if you can install RAD server on one machine and then connect to an Interbase instance on another machine, and can have multiple RAD server instances accessing the same interface instance?
And the answer is sure. You could have interface. I have, like I say, in my setup here in my home office, I've got a Linux machine and an IIS Windows machine, and then I've got my development machine. I've got another machine where I have my Interbase database license running. And so with FireDAC, you just make sure you connect to the right, either through the host name or through the IP address or through the FireDAC connection INI file to connect from your RAD server applications to yet a different machine that has an Interbase database or SQLite database or whatever it might be. Remember that in your deployment production servers, you'll want to copy over whatever runtime packages your application requires. So if using SQLite, there's a SQLite package, FireDAC driver package file for Windows and for Linux, Linux 64-bit for Win32, Win64. If anybody's still doing IIS and wanting to run Win32 server applications, there's a section in the install documentation about additional things you need to turn on for IIS so it can launch Win32 apps, but or DLLs and such. I didn't do that in my case. I just do everything as Win64 for both for Windows, and then Linux 64 is the only availability for Linux deployment.
So there's a couple of questions here, and you addressed this, but I'm going to mention it again just to see it occurring a lot. Internally, RAD server uses Interbase. Now you can use Interbase for your data that you're having RAD server serve out. You can have RAD server serve data that doesn't come from a database, or you can have RAD server serve data from any other database, Firebird, SQLite, whatever. So, but internally it uses Interbase, and that Interbase license is included with your license for RAD server. So, yeah, hopefully that's clear. And I pointed again, people think the ebook. Yeah, definitely check out the ebook if you have more questions. And there's series of blog posts that are. The first one was published yesterday. There'll be more published in the coming days. So check that out as well if you want more information on this. And then as far as load balancing, do you want to comment on that, David? Or my comment was to definitely that would be a web server configuration, right? You have your load balancer, your high availability configuration at the web server level, and you can have multiple RAD server instances. And then, like David said, those instances should all be pointing to the same database behind the scenes.
Yeah, there's application pools. Again, in your own code, if you want to do something in a RAD server backend, that then if some of that code is connecting to other computers that might be doing things, you may, for example, have endpoints that are going to call other services on cloud systems or on some other server, depending on if you are creating, a few layers or a multi-layer of servers and applications, depending on the architecture you require. So inside of an endpoint, you could be calling lots of different services as well. It might be some kind of shopping service, commerce service, fintech, payment service, and so on. And those systems will also have their own load balancing. On IIS, what's it called? I think application pools. You can set up a number of those. And again, Apache as well, you have configurations you can do. There's nothing that RAD server needs to do except if you want to, again, do some thread or task-based operations inside of endpoints for doing things.
So there's some questions here about running Apache on Windows. I believe that's supported. I'm not positive. And apparently Microsoft just announced yesterday that they're going to have their own Linux subsystem on Windows, Linux kernel subsystem on Windows, built into Windows. So I don't know how that's going to apply either. There's a lot of changes going on. Definitely check it out, and you can see if it works, or check out the doc wiki for more information. A lot of this you're probably going to have to try it and see what will work and how it will behave. This actually be interesting. Could you run Apache on the Linux subsystem on Windows and install RAD Server there. Yeah, I don't know. Try it and find out.
There was a question here about DataSetResource, and check out the DataSetResource component. You can turn on the allowed actions, right, for doing update, deletes, creation. So all those allowed actions are pre-built in actions. So you can definitely do CRUD operations for a specific database table that you're connected. So check out the FireDAC data resource. That's a new component that was added in 10.3 Rio. And so that was, I think, Ricardo's question. I'll say yes. Again,
do you have any suggestions? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, just make sure you do the allowed actions. I was just talking while I was typing. Sorry.
Do you have any suggestions or comments about threading within your endpoint?
I'm sorry, Jim. What was that again? Sorry.
Threading within this an endpoint.
I don't have an example. I mean, just use the parallel programming library PPL and start a task. Start a bunch of tasks and wait for them all, or wait for one of them to complete. That's just standard PPL programming that then under the covers uses the threading operations of the operating platform that you're going to be running that application on. But you can do anything inside of your endpoints, right?
You could. I think from an architectural point of view, you might, you might be concerned about how, because your request, the IIS is going to have its own thread pool that it's managing to send the request to your instance. And so usually when you're threading things to do I don't know, I guess you could do that, but definitely be aware of that you're within a thread pool already from IIS or Apache. So the more you have, your CPU is a limited resource. So yeah. You may be better off setting up a separate server, a separate instance that you would then be passing off things to if you have long running tasks or something like that, instead of doing threads within an endpoint. But again, that's kind of a higher level Apache IIS architectural consideration to think about.
I mean, most people will say if you're handling a request, you're calling an endpoint, do something as quick as possible and get the response back. But at the same time, if inside your implementation, you're calling out to some payment service that's going to respond back in, I don't know, half of a second or whatever it might be, especially if it's on a heavy shopping day, maybe their level of service, they might take a little longer to come back. But yeah, you could set up all that you want, right? Again, your endpoints can call other services on other platforms. You can be accessing data that's in a cloud instance somewhere. You could put your whole application in a cloud instance as well. So there is information about using Apache on Windows. Marco Cantu has some blog posts and videos about doing that. I didn't cover it in this webinar or in the ebook, but there's steps you can take to create a package file for Apache on Windows. So check out, do a search for Marco Cantu and Apache modules for Windows, and you should find that. I'll try to look for it too, but I know Marco's covered that. For me, though, I mean, there's so much energy going into IIS on Windows that it seems like the natural thing to deploy to on a Windows server.
Yeah, there are some advantages to using IIS on Windows as opposed to Apache. then there's also some, religious debates as well, I suppose. But really, I think, generally speaking, on Windows, you're better off using IIS. And there's various reasons for that. If you want to use Apache, you can, but you really need to be aware of the pros and cons of doing that, and it shouldn't be a offhanded decision to make. So definitely do research on that and make sure that you're making the right choice. And it's not something we can really answer for you on a webinar, just because it's a complex decision to make. Here's a question for you. Is it possible to parameterize the select or update operations for this data source resource?
So for parameterize, there is, as you saw in my example, there's a few cases like the sort prefix where you can set up these value fields, is the name of the property, for parameterizing or choosing to sort by a certain column, for example. Otherwise, right now, the DataSetResource, other than code you might write, it has these built-in actions, and then allowed actions, and then you can write code inside the allowed actions to do certain operations. Maybe I'm not sure about parameterize, what level of parameterization you want to do besides sorting or querying.
So
perfect.
Okay, fantastic.
David, Jim, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for attending, and you should get a follow-up email by tomorrow with the recording. Thanks, guys.
And a lot of people here are saying thank you, David, and I'm just going to echo this. Thank you for the webinar, and thank you for putting together that ebook. A lot of people have already downloaded and checked it out and are very excited about it. I know I've shared it with some of the MVPs as well, and they're all very excited to have that great resource available to them. So fantastic work. Thank you.